Sometimes, the people begging for help are the only ones willing to help someone else. Claire Donovan never imagined she would hear the words that would split her world apart on a freezing Thursday night in Chicago. The emergency room lights burned bright above her as she clutched her 8-year-old son's trembling hand. Ethan lay pale against the hospital bed, his small chest rising unevenly while machines beeped around him in sharp, terrifying rhythms. A doctor in blue scrubs pulled off his glasses and exhaled slowly before speaking the sentence Claire would remember for the rest of her life. "If we don't operate tonight, your son may not survive." The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. Claire stared at the doctor as though her mind refused to translate the words into reality. "No," she whispered. "There has to be another option." The doctor's expression softened with sympathy that sounded practiced from years of delivering bad news. "I'm sorry. Ethan's condition has worsened much faster than we expected." Claire looked down at her son. Ethan tried to smile despite the pain. "Mom," he whispered weakly. "Are we going to be okay?" Claire forced herself to nod, even as panic clawed through her chest. "Of course we are, baby." But deep inside, she wasn't sure anymore. A nurse stepped quietly into the room, carrying a clipboard. She avoided eye contact as she handed papers to Claire. "Billing needs authorization before surgery can begin." Claire looked at the total printed across the bottom of the page, and her knees nearly gave out. Even if she worked every day for the next 20 years, she could never afford that number. She swallowed hard. "I don't have this kind of money." The nurse lowered her voice. "You can speak with financial services downstairs, but at this hour." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Claire brushed Ethan's hair gently away from his forehead while trying not to cry in front of him. The little boy reached into his pocket with shaky fingers and pulled out a folded drawing. It showed the two of them standing under a bright yellow sun beside a tiny apartment building. Above their stick figures, Ethan had written the words, "Me," and "Mom forever." Claire bit her lip so hard it hurt. "Mom," Ethan whispered again. "You still have your lucky coat, right?" Her breathing caught instantly. The coat. The memory slammed into her mind like a wave. Just 48 hours earlier, that same coat had been wrapped around her shoulders as she walked home through the brutal Chicago snow after her diner shift ended past midnight. It had been the only thing keeping her warm, the only winter coat she owned. And before that night was over, she had given it away to a stranger shivering alone on the sidewalk. Claire closed her eyes for a second as the memory returned in painful detail. The snow, the wind, the old man sitting beside the bus stop, and the decision that changed everything. 48 hours earlier, Chicago felt like a city made of ice and exhaustion. Snow blew through the streets in sharp waves as Claire Donovan stepped out of Rosie's diner just after midnight, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. Her feet ached from a 14-hour shift, and the smell of burnt coffee still clung to her hair. The diner owner had apologized for cutting her hours again, but apologies did not pay rent, and they certainly did not pay hospital bills. Claire checked the time on her cracked phone screen and sighed. She still had a 20-minute walk home because she could not afford the bus fare tonight. As she hurried down the sidewalk, she glanced into a pharmacy window and stopped for a moment when she saw a display of children's vitamins beside a sign advertising winter toys. Ethan would have loved the little astronaut set spinning slowly under the bright lights. Her chest tightened. She hated how often she had to say the word no lately. No toys. No pizza nights. No field trips. No new sneakers. Every dollar she earned disappeared into medications, overdue utilities, and the growing stack of medical envelopes waiting on the kitchen table. The wind suddenly cut harder through the street, making Claire shiver violently. She rubbed her hands together and kept moving until she noticed someone sitting alone beneath the flickering light of a bus stop bench. At first, she almost walked past him. In Chicago, people learn not to stare, learn not to stop. But then she heard it. A rough cough. Weak. Painful. She turned her head and saw an elderly man curled against the side of the bench, trembling under the falling snow. He wore no gloves, no hat. His gray sweater looked paper-thin against the brutal cold. Claire slowed her steps. The old man kept his eyes lowered as if he was used to being invisible. Cars passed by without stopping. Pedestrians crossed the street to avoid him. Claire looked down at the small grocery bag in her hand containing canned soup and a loaf of discounted bread meant for her and Ethan. Then she looked back at the man. "Sir," she asked softly. The man raised tired blue eyes toward her. Up close, he looked exhausted more than dangerous. His cheeks were pale from the cold. You okay? She asked. He gave a weak smile. I have been better. Claire hesitated. Her fingers tightened around her coat collar. It was the only warm thing she owned. Ethan had begged her for weeks to buy a thicker one, but she always laughed it off and told him Chicago winters built character. Another harsh gust of wind swept down the block. The old man winced and coughed again. Claire swallowed hard. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she slipped her coat off her shoulders and held it out toward him. The old man looked stunned. Miss, no, he said immediately. You need this. I will survive, Claire replied quietly. But you might not out here tonight. He stared at her as though nobody had spoken kindly to him in years. Slowly, he accepted the coat with shaking hands. Why would someone with so little still give something away? He asked. Claire thought about Ethan waiting at home in their tiny apartment, probably pretending not to be tired so he could stay awake until she returned. Then she smiled faintly. Because my son is watching me, she answered. For a long moment, the old man said nothing. Snow continued falling around them in silence. Then his eyes filled with an emotion Claire could not quite understand. Almost grief. Almost hope. And just before she walked away, he said something that made her stop cold. One day, the man whispered, your kindness will come back to you when you need it most. Claire spent the rest of the walk home hugging her arms tightly against the freezing wind, trying not to think about the coat she had just given away. By the time she reached the old apartment building on the south side of Chicago, her fingers were numb and her teeth would not stop chattering. The hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old carpet as she climbed 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B. Before she could even unlock the door, it swung open suddenly. Ethan stood there in oversized pajamas with messy brown hair and sleepy eyes full of worry. Mom, he said softly. You are late. Claire immediately forced a smile onto her face. I know, buddy. The diner was busy tonight. Ethan frowned the second he noticed her shoulders. Where is your coat? Claire paused for half a second. I gave it to somebody who needed it more. Ethan stared at her quietly. Most children his age would have complained or asked questions, but Ethan simply stepped aside to let her in. Their apartment was small enough that Claire could see almost everything from the doorway. The tiny kitchen table covered in unopened medical bills. The old couch with a blanket folded neatly across the armrest. The space heater buzzing loudly near the window because the building's radiator barely worked anymore. Ethan walked over and handed her his own blanket without saying a word. Claire nearly broke down right there. You keep that, she said gently. I am okay. Ethan tilted his head. Was the person really cold? Claire nodded slowly as she sat beside him on the couch. Yeah, he was. Ethan looked down for a moment before asking the question that made Claire's chest ache. Did he look lonely? She blinked in surprise. What makes you ask that? Ethan shrugged. People look different when they are lonely. Claire wrapped an arm around him and kissed the top of his head. Sometimes she forgot how deeply her son noticed the world around him. He did, she admitted quietly. Ethan leaned against her shoulder. Then I am glad you gave him your coat. Claire closed her eyes for a second, letting herself breathe in the warmth of having him close. No matter how difficult life became, Ethan somehow remained kind, gentle, soft in a world that had not been soft with him. The next morning started before sunrise. Claire woke to the sound of coughing from Ethan's bedroom. Her heart immediately tightened. She rushed in and found him sitting upright in bed, breathing harder than usual. Hey, she whispered calmly, trying not to scare him. Talk to me. Ethan forced a weak smile. I am okay, Mom. Just tired. But Claire knew better. The color had drained from his face again. His medication bottles sat nearly empty on the dresser beside him. She checked the time and mentally calculated how many hours she could work before rushing him to his next appointment across town. Every day felt like balancing on the edge of disaster. One missed paycheck, one overdue bill, one bad phone call. That was all it would take for everything to collapse. As Claire helped Ethan get dressed for school, someone knocked on the apartment door. She froze instantly. Rent was already 2 weeks late. Slowly, she opened the door expecting the landlord. Instead, she found a delivery man holding a small white box. Package for Claire Donovan, he said. Claire frowned. I think you have the wrong apartment. Nope, the man replied. Signed and paid for already. Confused, Claire accepted the box and closed the door behind her. Ethan looked up curiously from the kitchen table. What is it? Claire carefully lifted the lid. Inside sat a brand new dark blue winter coat with a handwritten note resting on top. Her breath caught as she unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The message was short, but it made her heart stop. Kindness should never leave a good person out in the cold. Claire read the handwritten note 3 times before she could finally breathe again. Ethan stared at the coat with wide eyes. "Mom," he whispered. "That was from the old man, right?" Claire slowly nodded. The dark blue coat looked expensive, far more expensive than anything she had owned in years. She touched the fabric carefully, almost afraid to wrinkle it. For a moment, warmth spread through her chest. Not because of the coat itself, but because somebody had remembered her kindness. Somebody had cared enough to give something back. Ethan smiled softly. "See? I told you good things come back." Claire forced herself to smile, but deep down she knew life did not always work that way. Sometimes good people still lost everything. Sometimes kindness changed nothing at all. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her purse before helping Ethan prepare for school. Throughout the morning, she could not stop thinking about the mysterious old man. Who was he? How had he found her address? And why did his eyes look so familiar when he thanked her that night? By afternoon, the questions disappeared beneath the weight of reality again. Claire hurried from one diner table to another carrying plates of burgers and coffee while customers barely looked at her face. Her feet burned from standing since dawn, but every tip mattered. She kept checking her phone during shifts, hoping the specialist would call with better news about Ethan's condition. Instead, the only messages she received were overdue payment reminders. Around 3 o'clock, her manager approached her quietly near the kitchen. "Claire," he said carefully, "your son's school has been trying to reach you." Her stomach dropped instantly. "What happened?" "I do not know." The nurse said it sounded urgent. Claire grabbed her phone with trembling hands and immediately called the school back. A frightened voice answered almost instantly. "Ms. Donovan? This is Lincoln Elementary." Ethan collapsed during recess. The ambulance already took him to St. Catherine Medical Center. The tray slipped from Claire's hands and crashed onto the floor. Every sound inside the diner disappeared behind the pounding in her ears. "Was he breathing?" she asked desperately. "Yes, but he was struggling." Claire did not even remove her apron before running outside into the freezing wind. She barely remembered the bus ride downtown. Her thoughts spiraled through every terrifying possibility imaginable. Ethan had fainted before, but never like this. Never badly enough for an ambulance. By the time she reached St. Catherine Medical Center, snow had started falling again. The giant hospital tower rose over the city like a wall of glass and steel, glowing cold beneath the gray sky. Claire rushed through the revolving doors and sprinted toward the emergency desk. "My son," she gasped. "Ethan Donovan." He was brought in from Lincoln Elementary. The receptionist typed for a moment before pointing down the hall. "Room 12. Claire ran so fast, she nearly slipped on the polished floor. When she reached the room, she found Ethan lying in bed connected to monitors while doctors spoke quietly near the doorway. The sight of him so pale and still nearly shattered her. "Mom," Ethan whispered weakly when he saw her. Claire rushed to his side and grabbed his hand tightly. "I am here, baby. I am here." A doctor stepped forward with a serious expression. "Ms. Donovan, we need to discuss surgery immediately." Claire felt the room spin around her. "Surgery?" The doctor nodded slowly. "Ethan's condition is progressing much faster than expected. Without treatment, his heart may not be strong enough much longer." Claire looked at her son in horror. Ethan tried to smile bravely despite the fear in his eyes. Then the doctor said the words that made Claire feel truly helpless for the first time in her life. "The procedure can save him," he explained carefully. "But your insurance will only cover a small portion." Claire's lips trembled. "How much are we talking about?" The doctor hesitated before handing her a printed estimate. Claire stared at the number in disbelief. It was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. Claire stared at the estimate in complete disbelief. The numbers blurred together beneath the bright hospital lights until she finally lowered the paper with trembling hands. "There has to be some mistake," she whispered. The doctor's expression remained sympathetic but distant, the expression of someone who had delivered difficult news too many times before. "I wish there was," he said quietly. "Ethan needs a specialized cardiac procedure. Without it, his condition will continue getting worse." Claire looked toward her son, sleeping weakly against the pillow. He looked so small inside the giant hospital bed. Just 8 years old. 8 years old. And already fighting battles most adults could not survive emotionally. How long do I have? She asked softly. The doctor hesitated. Not long. Those 2 words hollowed her out completely. After the doctor left, Claire sat beside Ethan and tried to think clearly through the panic rising inside her chest. She opened her banking app, knowing exactly what she would find. $87.12. That was everything she had left after rent, medication, and overdue utilities. She rubbed her forehead as tears burned behind her eyes. Ethan slowly opened his eyes. Mom. Claire immediately wiped her face and forced another smile. Hey, sweetheart. You are doing the fake smile again. His weak voice nearly broke her heart. Claire looked away for a second before taking his hand gently. Everything is going to be okay. Ethan studied her quietly, far too smart for his age. You do not have enough money, do you? Claire froze. Children were supposed to worry about homework and cartoons, not hospital debt. But life had forced Ethan to grow up too quickly. Do not think about that, she whispered. I just need you to rest. Ethan looked toward the ceiling for a moment. Mom. Yeah. If something happens to me, I do not want you to be alone. Claire immediately grabbed his hand tighter. Do not say that. Her voice cracked despite her efforts to stay calm. Nothing is happening to you. Do you hear me? Ethan nodded slowly, though fear still lingered in his eyes. A few minutes later, a billing representative arrived carrying a folder against her chest. She spoke politely, but her voice carried the cold professionalism of someone discussing paperwork instead of a child's life. Ms. Donovan, we need to discuss financial authorization before the surgical team proceeds. Claire stood slowly. Can we talk outside? In the hallway, the woman opened the folder and began explaining payment plans, insurance limitations, and financing options Claire could never qualify for. Every sentence felt more hopeless than the last. I can barely pay rent, Claire admitted quietly. I work double shifts at a diner. There is no way I can afford this. The representative gave a tight smile that never reached her eyes. I understand this is difficult. No, Claire thought bitterly. You do not. Please, Claire whispered. There has to be some kind of charity program. Something. The woman glanced down at her tablet. Those funds are extremely limited and prioritized case by case. My son could die. Several people walking nearby turned to look. The representative lowered her voice slightly. I am sorry, but emotional situations do not change hospital policy. Claire felt humiliation burn through her entire body. Emotional situations? She repeated quietly. That is my child in there. And we are trying to help him, the woman replied. But treatment requires financial clearance. Claire stared at her in stunned silence. The woman handed over another stack of forms. Until then, surgery cannot officially be scheduled. Then she walked away. Claire stood frozen in the middle of the hallway while people passed around her carrying flowers, coffee cups, and balloons. The world kept moving as though her son's life was not hanging by a thread. Her breathing became shaky. She leaned against the wall and covered her mouth, trying not to fall apart completely. Then, from somewhere above the hospital lobby, unseen eyes were already watching her carefully. Claire remained in the hallway for several seconds after the billing representative disappeared around the corner. Her hands trembled so badly that the paperwork nearly slipped onto the polished floor. Around her, the hospital moved with cold efficiency. Nurses hurried past with tablets in hand. Elevators opened and closed endlessly. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed for a brief moment before the sound vanished again beneath the distant hum of machines and footsteps. But for Claire, time felt frozen. She slowly returned to Ethan's room and forced herself to breathe normally before walking inside. Ethan was awake again, staring quietly out the window at the snow falling over downtown Chicago. Mom, he asked softly, did I make you miss work? Claire swallowed hard. Do not worry about work. But if you do not work, we cannot pay bills. The simple honesty in his voice shattered something. Inside her, no child should have to think like that. Claire sat beside him and brushed his hair back gently. Listen to me, she whispered. Your job is just getting better. Nothing else matters. Ethan studied her face carefully. You look scared. Claire opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, a nurse entered carrying medication. Excuse me, Ms. Donovan, she said kindly. We need to take Ethan for another scan. Claire stepped aside as the nurse carefully wheeled Ethan's bed toward the hallway. Ethan reached his hand out toward her as they moved away. "Do not leave, okay?" Claire forced a smile through the tears burning in her eyes. "I am not going anywhere." Once they disappeared around the corner, Claire leaned heavily against the wall outside the room. Her entire body felt exhausted beyond words. She had not eaten since morning. She had barely slept all week. And now her son's life depended on money she did not have. She looked down at the folded note still tucked inside her purse from the mysterious old man. "Your kindness will come back to you when you need it most." Claire closed her eyes tightly. She wanted to believe those words mattered. But hospitals did not run on kindness. They ran on payments, approvals, and signatures. A voice suddenly interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Donovan?" Claire looked up to see a young hospital employee standing nearby. "Someone from administration would like to speak with you upstairs." Her stomach tightened instantly. "Administration?" "Yes, ma'am. They asked me to escort you personally." Claire hesitated. "Did something happen to my son?" "No," the employee replied quickly. "Please come with me." Confused and anxious, Claire followed him toward a private elevator near the far end of the hospital lobby. As the elevator rose higher and higher, the hospital around her began to change. The crowded waiting rooms disappeared. The fluorescent lights became softer. The floors turned quieter, cleaner, almost luxurious. Claire looked down at her worn diner uniform and suddenly felt painfully out of place. Finally, the elevator doors opened onto an elegant upper floor lined with glass offices and expensive artwork. Men and women in business suits moved quickly through the hallway carrying folders and tablets. Several glanced curiously at Claire as she passed. The employee stopped outside a large conference room with dark wooden doors. Through the glass walls, Claire could see executives seated around a massive table. Then the entire room suddenly stood at once. Not because of her, because of the elderly man slowly walking toward the front of the room. Claire's breath caught instantly. The same blue eyes, the same tired face, the same man she had found freezing at the bus stop. Except now he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Employees stepped aside the second he moved. One woman whispered nervously, "Mr. Hayes is here." Claire stared in complete disbelief as the old man turned toward her calmly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then his eyes softened with recognition. "Claire," he said quietly, "I was hoping you would come." Claire could barely process what she was seeing. The frail old man from the bus stop now stood at the center of a private executive floor while doctors, administrators, and corporate staff watched him with nervous attention. The employee beside her quietly stepped back as though even standing too close to him required permission. Walter Hayes motioned gently toward a nearby office. "Please," he said calmly, "come inside." Claire followed him in silence, her heart pounding harder with every step. The office overlooked the entire Chicago skyline through massive glass windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Snow drifted across the city below like white smoke beneath the evening lights. Walter closed the door softly behind them and turned toward her with a tired expression that no expensive suit could fully hide. "I know this must be confusing," he said. Claire stared at him in disbelief. "You own this hospital?" Walter gave a small nod. "St. Catherine is one of 7 hospitals under my foundation." Claire's mind raced back to the freezing bus stop. The thin sweater, the shaking hands, the loneliness in his eyes. None of it made sense anymore. "Why were you out there?" she asked quietly. Walter looked down for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes it is the only way to see who people really are." Claire frowned slightly. Walter walked slowly toward the window overlooking the city. "When people think you have power, money, influence," he said softly, "they treat you differently. They become careful, polite, calculated. But when they think you are worthless," he paused, "that is when you see the truth." Claire remembered how everyone had ignored him that night. Everyone except her. Walter turned back toward her, and for the first time, she noticed how exhausted he truly looked beneath the polished appearance. "Do you know how many people walked past me that evening?" he asked. Claire said nothing. "Hundreds." His voice remained calm, but pain lingered underneath every word. "Most would not even look at me." Claire lowered her eyes slightly. "I did not help you because I expected anything back." "I know," Walter replied immediately. "That is exactly why I cannot ignore what is happening to your son." Claire's breath caught. Walter walked toward his desk and pressed a button on the intercom. "Get Dr. Kaplan, Dr. Reeves," and the surgical board into conference room A immediately. The assistant on the other end answered without hesitation. Yes, Mr. Hayes. Within minutes, several doctors and executives entered the conference room outside the office. The atmosphere changed instantly the moment Walter stepped inside. Every conversation stopped. Every person straightened in their seat. Claire stood quietly near the doorway, feeling completely out of place among the expensive suits and medical directors. Walter remained standing at the head of the table. I have reviewed the Donovan case, he said firmly. One administrator shifted nervously. Sir, financial authorization is still pending. Walter slowly looked toward him. A child's survival should never depend on paperwork. Silence filled the room. Another executive carefully cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, hospital policy requires. I wrote the policy, Walter interrupted calmly. And I can change it. Nobody spoke after that. Walter turned toward the head surgeon. How soon can you operate on Ethan Donovan? The surgeon answered immediately. We can prepare the operating room within the hour. Claire felt her knees nearly give out. Wait, she whispered shakily. You mean you are approving the surgery? Walter looked directly at her. No child should suffer because a parent cannot afford hope. Claire covered her mouth as tears instantly filled her eyes. One of the administrators glanced nervously at the paperwork. What about payment authorization? Walter's expression hardened for the first time. Send every bill directly to my office. The room fell completely silent. Then Walter added something that made several executives visibly uncomfortable. And tomorrow morning, I want a full review of every denied pediatric case from the past 12 months. Claire stared at him in shock as the entire hospital leadership suddenly began moving under his command. For the first time since Ethan collapsed, hope finally returned to her chest. Everything moved quickly after that. Nurses rushed through the hallways preparing the operating room, while specialists reviewed Ethan's scans for the emergency procedure. Claire sat beside her son holding his hand tightly, trying to stay calm while fear still twisted inside her chest. Ethan looked exhausted, but when he saw her crying quietly, he squeezed her fingers with surprising strength. Mom, he whispered, did they say yes? Claire nodded immediately. Yeah, baby. They are going to help you. Ethan smiled weakly. I knew it. Claire brushed tears from her face. Knew what? That good people still exist. His words hit her harder than anything else that night. A few minutes later, Walter Hayes quietly stepped into the room. The expensive suit and powerful presence somehow felt smaller beside Ethan's hospital bed. Ethan looked at him curiously. You are the man from the bus stop, he said softly. Walter gave a gentle smile. I am. Ethan frowned slightly. Mom said you were cold. Walter glanced at Claire before answering quietly. Your mother made sure I was not. Ethan looked at him for a moment before saying something that made the old man visibly emotional. She does that a lot. Silence settled over the room briefly. Walter slowly walked closer to the bed. You raised a very special young man, he told Claire softly. Claire swallowed hard. I tried. Walter looked down at Ethan, his expression suddenly distant, almost haunted by something deep in his memory. I had a daughter once, he said quietly. Claire looked up in surprise. Walter rarely sounded uncertain, but now every word seemed heavier than before. Her name was Lily, he continued. She was about Ethan's age when she became sick. The room fell silent except for the faint beeping of the heart monitor nearby. Walter stared at the floor for a moment before speaking again. This was many years ago. Back then, I was not the man people know now. I was building my company, working constantly, chasing success because I thought money could solve everything. His voice lowered. But when Lily needed treatment, we discovered the hospital responsible for her care delayed critical decisions because of insurance disputes and administrative approvals. Claire felt her chest tighten. Walter looked out the window toward the snowy city skyline. By the time everything was approved, it was too late. No one spoke. Even the nurses nearby had gone still. Walter took a slow breath before continuing. After losing her, I promised myself no parent would ever feel that powerless inside one of my hospitals. He gave a bitter smile. But somewhere along the way, policies and executives slowly replaced compassion again. Claire remembered the billing representative downstairs. The cold voice. The paperwork. The humiliation. Walter noticed the understanding in her eyes. That night at the bus stop, he said softly, I was questioning whether people had changed at all, whether kindness still existed when there was nothing to gain. He looked directly at Claire now. Then you gave your only coat to a stranger you thought would never repay you. Claire lowered her eyes. Anyone should have helped. Walter shook his head slowly. But they did not. Ethan looked between them quietly before asking, "Did my mom save you?" Walter's eyes filled with emotion for the first time. "Yes," he answered honestly. "In more ways than you know." A nurse entered gently moments later. "We are ready for surgery." Claire immediately stood as fear surged through her chest again. Ethan reached for her hand. "Do not cry, Mom." Claire bent down carefully and kissed his forehead. "I love you more than anything in this world." Ethan smiled faintly. "I know." As the nurses wheeled him toward the operating room, Claire felt her legs weaken beneath her. Walter stepped beside her quietly in the hallway. For several seconds, neither of them spoke while the doors slowly closed behind Ethan. Then Walter said something so softly she almost missed it. "No child should have to earn the right to be saved." The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. Claire spent every minute sitting in the quiet waiting area outside the operating wing, clutching Ethan's small drawing in both hands while exhaustion pulled at every part of her body. Snow continued falling beyond the hospital windows, covering Chicago in white silence as the night slowly faded into morning. Walter Hayes remained there the entire time. He never returned to his executive meetings, never answered the endless calls buzzing across his phone. Instead, he sat a few chairs away from Claire in complete silence, occasionally glancing toward the operating room doors with the same fear she felt inside her own chest. Around 4 in the morning, Claire finally spoke softly. "You do not have to stay here." Walter looked toward her calmly. "Yes," he replied. "I do." Claire lowered her eyes to Ethan's drawing again. "I spent so long feeling invisible," she admitted quietly. "Like the world only cared about people with money." Walter nodded slowly. "Sometimes institutions forget they were built to serve human beings, not numbers." Claire let out a shaky breath. "I almost lost him because I could not afford help." Walter's expression darkened with regret. "And that failure belongs to me too." Before Claire could respond, the operating room doors suddenly opened. Both of them stood instantly. Dr. Kaplan stepped out first, removing his surgical cap with a tired smile. Claire's heart nearly stopped. "Your son is going to be okay," he said. The world around her blurred instantly through tears. Claire covered her mouth as relief crashed over her, so powerfully she could barely stay standing. Walter quietly steadied her arm before she collapsed. "The surgery was successful," the doctor continued. "Ethan still has a long recovery ahead, but we expect him to make a full recovery." Claire broke down completely then, crying harder than she had in years. Not from fear this time, but from finally hearing the words she thought she might never hear again. A few hours later, Claire entered Ethan's recovery room carefully. Morning sunlight poured softly through the hospital windows while machines hummed steadily nearby. Ethan looked pale and exhausted, but alive. Truly alive. His eyes slowly opened when he heard her voice. "Mom." Claire immediately smiled through fresh tears. "Hey, sweetheart." Ethan glanced around weakly. "Did it work?" Claire laughed softly through the emotion in her throat. "Yeah, it worked." Ethan smiled faintly before whispering, "I told you good people still exist." Claire kissed his forehead gently. Standing quietly near the doorway, Walter looked away for a moment as though trying to hide the emotion in his eyes. Months passed after that winter night. Ethan grew stronger every week. The color returned to his face. His laughter returned to their apartment. And for the first time in years, Claire no longer woke up terrified of losing him. Walter kept his promise about the hospital bills. But he did something else too. He created a new pediatric foundation program at St. Catherine Medical Center to guarantee emergency treatment for families who could not afford care. And when Claire received an offer to help manage the foundation's outreach department, she cried all over again. One bright spring afternoon, Claire walked through a city park while Ethan ran across the basketball court laughing with other children. Walter sat quietly on a nearby bench watching him play beneath the warm sunlight. Claire sat beside him with a soft smile. "You changed our lives," she said quietly. Walter shook his head slowly while watching Ethan laugh in the distance. "No," he answered. "Your kindness changed mine first." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the trees while children's laughter echoed across the park. Then Walter smiled faintly and said the words Claire would remember forever. "That coat kept me warm for one night," he whispered. but your compassion warmed me for the rest of my life.